We are here in IDP. We have the pleasure to receive here in IDP Mrs. Teresa Ter-Minassian, former director of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, former leader of a mission here in Brazil, and actually consultant in the Interamerican Bank of Development, and also Professor Ehtisham Ahmad, senior fellow in London School of Economics and Political Science, and also senior fellow in Bonn University. We are really glad to receive you both here. It's an enormous pleasure to receive you in IDP and to make this interview with you and know a little bit about your experience and your opinions, proposed to some questions that are really relevant in the international and national context. We would like to know what you think about Brazil and about the world in this scenario of an economical and financial and fiscal crisis. And so we can start. I would like to start question what you think about the situation of Brazil and the world in this crisis, in this situation of crisis that we are living since 2008 and 2011. Do you believe we have a short-term resolution? We can have a short-term resolution for these problems, or maybe we are in a turning point that demand us a new kind of solutions and a new kind of perspectives to face this kind of challenge. Professor Ahmad.
I think it's useful to recognize that the crisis is a global crisis. It affects Brazil, it affects China, it affects India, it affects Europe as well. So you see the crisis in European countries. What the crisis does, together with fairly tight management or implementation of fiscal rules, is that some of the basic imbalances in intergovernmental relations come to the fore. This is both in the case of China, where with subnational governments, particularly the borrowing of subnational governments and the liabilities. In the case of Brazil, you have problems with the way the tax system is set up. In Europe, the response has been largely to make sure that the costs of doing business are reduced. And a key element in doing that is moving from taxes that are borne by businesses to the value-added tax in a way that reduces the cost of doing business and making the country more competitive. At the same time, there's been a lot of emphasis on fiscal prudence, fiscal rules, and making sure that they're implemented properly, which means you set up information systems, you set up mechanisms for monitoring, and then, of course, you have the political issues about how far you can cut social spending or whether adjustments have to come elsewhere. In the Brazilian case, you have a very useful fiscal responsibility law. You also have fairly tight monitoring mechanisms. Brazil does very well in that regard in terms of monitoring what lower levels of government do on a standardized basis. You're still not using the GFSM methodology, though that is required in the next year or so, to require states to move toward GFSM to be able to track liabilities in a consistent manner. And that's a very important point. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The problem is that it's not sufficient because then you have all the fissures, all the problems with the intergovernmental relations coming to the fore. And in particular, you have problems with your value-added tax. The value-added tax is adding to the cost of doing business, it's cascading, leads to tax wars, and is not the sort of value-added tax that the European countries are moving towards to ease the cost of doing business. So in a sense, Brazil is becoming a very difficult place to attract foreign investment, to attract investment for employment generation in the long run. So in a sense, not only do you have the war, a fiscal war between the states and municipalities, between subnational governments and the federal government, you're adding to the cost of doing business in Brazil. So in the longer run, although you have many of the mechanisms, the necessary mechanisms to implement fiscal responsibility legislation, which to be honest is needed, because you can't borrow your way indefinitely through a crisis. It just doesn't work. It's you've got global markets, you get punished by the capital markets. So really, you have the instruments, but the structure requires a lot of work, which is who does what in terms of responsibility for spending. How do you assure or ensure that you have good education provided to the poor, social services, who pays for it, who's held responsible for it? At the same time, how do you raise revenues, which you're raising more revenues than any other developing country in the world? It's done in a very inefficient manner. So really what you need to do is to see whether you can actually not raise taxes, but perhaps rationalize the existing taxes so that they actually act as an encouragement or inducement for investment, not as a constraint to investment. At the same time, you have to be worried about efficient social programs. So plus attracting investment in the right places. So you're looking at a coherent strategy for sustainable growth and employment generation in an increasingly competitive world. You're really competing with a very, very difficult situation, for example, faced by China or India. Even though you're part of the BRICS, you essentially have to use India and China as reference points. Of course, also Europe and the United States.
Okay, well, unfortunately, in my view, today Brazil faces what you would call a perfect storm. That is a situation which on the political front is characterized by a lot of pressures on the ruling coalition, internal and as well pressures, partly motivated or sort of ignited by the corruption scandals and so on. Or in global economic context, which is one of, I would say, a tepid recovery in Europe, a little bit stronger in the US, but still not fully at potential. And in any case, it may require, if it were to accelerate, it might require the Fed to move faster and stronger in raising interest rates. And a very significant downturn in China and other emerging markets. So the international economic context is very unfavorable in a way to Brazil at this point. But also there is an internal economic situation which is very difficult because it's characterized by recession and still relatively high inflationary expectations. Although personally I am convinced that inflation is on a downward trend as a result of the recession, but still there are pressures coming also from the depreciation of the real. So this puts the central bank in a very difficult situation in gauging the appropriate degree of monetary restraint. But most important, this internal, or this situation of what I would call domestic stagflation is the result of policy mistakes of the last several years. Basically, you have had a fiscal policy which has been quite weak and non-transparent, in fact weaker than the statistics suggest. The debt the gross public debt, which is the variable that the markets focus on mostly, is on a clear upward trend. And there has been more than 4 years, I would say almost a decade, of basically no structural reform, or very little in terms of structural reforms. And this has had an impact on the potential of growth of the country. So what Brazil now needs, in my view, is a positive confidence shock. And this requires, first of all, some clarification of the political situation, and a sense that there is a working coalition with a minimum of political cohesion, so that the government can put forward a package of measures and hope to be able to carry it through in Congress without having to negotiate every little bit and give here and there. It needs a fiscal adjustment which is less concentrated on the size, but more on the quality and sustainability of the adjustment, which means more emphasis on changes in expenditure policies, as opposed to just expenditure cuts, wherever one can get one's hands on a cut. So this means structural reforms in the social security system, in the civil service, in the way in which the budget process is conducted, in the degree of rigidities and the earmarking in spending, more emphasis on the quality of spending and value for money, because there is a need to improve public services, but with less cost. And very importantly, a tax reform, a proper tax reform, which, frankly, would need almost starting from scratch, because, all the major taxes in Brazil now have major problems. I mean, in particular, on the indirect tax side, whether it is the ICMS, the IPI and the COFIN and the PIS/COFINS, there is a need to, as Ehtisham said, reduce compliance costs for taxpayers. There is a need to reduce cumulativity, which of course is very detrimental, and quite frankly, the fact that we are the government is now having to propose a tax like the CPMF, which is a very cumulative tax. This is a very distortive tax that can have impact also on financial markets. It's very unfortunate. I think there is a need to recompose the tax burden, putting more of the weight on taxation of incomes and capital rather than on taxation of goods and services. The step that was taken yesterday, or announced yesterday, of increasing capital gains tax, in my view, goes in the right direction. But it's a small step, and there is more that needs to be done. There is also a need to reestablish more transparency in the fiscal accounts. I think this government, Mr. Levy has put a lot of emphasis on this, and I very much applaud his efforts in this respect. But, quite frankly, in Brazil now, there is a need for more the strengthening of the institutions in terms of fuller compliance with all the requirements of the fiscal responsibility law, which frankly in the last few years has been circumvented in many ways, as we all know. And there would be very desirable to create some more independent fiscal institution, a fiscal watchdog that could give let's say, a credibility to the fiscal accounts, and certify that there have been no contabilidade creativa. I think that I would like to say a few words on how I believe that intergovernmental fiscal cooperation, which was the topic of the seminar which brought us here, can figure in this agenda. In a federal country like Brazil, any agenda of structural reforms, whether fiscal or regulatory or in any almost any areas except the monetary, needs to be bought also by the subnational governments. There is strengthening intergovernmental cooperation fora would help in identifying the possible basis for consensus on these reforms. I think one theme of the seminar, which was very much emphasized both in Ehtisham's presentation and in my own, is that structural fiscal reforms create gainers and losers. And therefore, it is necessary to work on packages in which some win from one component of the package and others from another component, so that you can get the basis for consensus. And in this respect, to have fora, level fora with the strong leadership from the central government, but to listen and to try to mediate and find the basis for consensus across the states would be a very important component for an effort towards bringing in structural fiscal reforms, whether it is reforms of the social security or reforms of the tax system, in particular, the ICMS, reforms of the intergovernmental transfers and so on. I think the seminar also emphasized the need for more cooperation at the sectoral level, between both on an horizontal level, that is to say among the states, and between the state and the central government. Brazil, in an international comparison, Brazil has relatively limited sort of institution for intergovernmental fiscal cooperation, because basically in the fiscal area is primarily the CONFAS and the CONCEFAS, one vertical and one horizontal fiscal cooperation forum. But it is with a fairly limited mandate, and it has become more limited in practice because all the attention has been focused on the incentives and under the ICMS and the guerra fiscal, etc. So I think that there is a need to broaden the sort of mandate and the scope of action of the CONFAS, and there is also a need to create some higher level heads of government type of fora. And there are plenty of examples of this in various countries, and part of our work in the seminar was highlighting these relevant international experiences in this respect.
Add a few words to that. I very much agree with what Teresa has put very nicely for Brazil. Just that, you have standard institutions for intergovernmental cooperation. In Australia, you have the Grants Commission. India, you have the Finance Commission. And of course, there's a planning process which allocates the investment resources. And you have the Commission of State Prime Ministers in Germany. For something like the changing revenue assignments, it's very, very difficult to do. Split bases exist actually in India and in Germany, which are as much a constraint to efficient use of the tax instruments as they are in Brazil. India has been trying to get around the existing institutional problems by setting up a commission of state finance ministers, headed by an opposition state finance minister, for a number of years. And they came up with a proposal for unification and a constitutional amendment. It was blocked because some states lost. And it was blocked by the BJP, which is the country in power, which is the party in power now. BJP has been in power now almost for a year and a half, going on 2 years. It picked up that proposal and said we're going to implement it. Then it was opposed by the other party because again you had gainers and losers among states. The problem is that a constitutional reform of the sort that's involved with changing revenue assignments is very difficult. And it can't be done just in terms of revenue assignments. And as Teresa very correctly pointed out, it involves looking at the transfer system, looking at gainers and losers. The Mexicans carried out a fairly major reform in 2013 without too much in the way of compensation. But then they brought into the package of reforms the value-added tax, fixing the value-added tax, fixing the corporate income tax, fixing the personal income tax, bringing in a carbon tax, putting it all together, and then offsetting gainers and losers that way. It was gainers and losers amongst firms, it was gainers and losers amongst states. So they were able to use tax-on-tax interactions to minimize the burden on different states or different. The point is that the Indian reforms are stuck, even though they have an extra commission of the state finance ministers. Germany has the same problem, and they put up a commission of state prime ministers in 2003. It didn't come up with any significant reforms. 2006, again, they attempted to do it with a coalition government in power in Berlin. It didn't work. They came up with a fiscal responsibility legislation, a very tight debt brake. The problem is that the revenue assignments are inadequate for the states, and the debt brake, which is due to come into effect in 2019, is like the country is like a train about to hit a brick wall. So now again, they're very rapidly trying to fix it. The point is that you need to broaden the terms of reference. It's not just the value-added tax. It's the value-added tax. It's looking at an equalization framework. You don't have an equalization framework in Brazil. You have too much earmarking, as Mrs. Ter-Minassian said. So much earmarking that no state is responsible for anything. It's always at the request of someone higher up. So the responsibility for spending, financed at the margin with taxes that don't add to the cost of doing business. So that means you're looking at a whole broad range of taxes, and not just the value-added tax in isolation. Looking at the value-added tax, you're looking at equalization framework, you're looking at rationalizing spending, and getting greater accountability at the state level, and in particular at the municipal level. If you're looking in the long run for sustainable development, it's going to be how you manage your large urban cities, metropolitan areas. Where do you put your new investment? Can you create new hubs? Will the new hubs then be sustainable? Or will you keep adding to Sao Paulo, which is hiding to nothing? So really you're looking at fairly serious constraints. On the large metropolitan areas, where do you put your new hubs? How you provide public services in the new hubs? Because then again you're looking at the need for the private sector to come in and invest efficiently, but then have the right level playing field for an efficient operation. Which you have to make it attractive for, say, aerospace or Nissan or Honda or BMW to put their plants, not in China, but in Brazil. But they're putting them in Mexico now. BMW has moved its headquarters to Mexico. Nissan, Kia, aerospace have all moved to Mexico in the last year. So really what you want to do is to create sufficient basis for fairly large foreign direct investment, but also investment by Brazilians. I mean, you have a very nascent aerospace. Embraer is very well known. So I mean, the basis is there for building, but the preconditions to act efficiently in the international markets are not there. And it's not just exports, because if you have an open trade regime, it's also whether you can sell domestically, whether you're able to compete with cars produced in Mexico or cars produced in China. So your producers have to be competitive in textiles, in carpets, in services. And you have the people. You have the talent and the people, but you look at your education quality. Look at your PISA scores.
We have here in Brazil traditional difficulty in our federation since
Absolutely.
Federation was
Absolutely.
born.
Yeah.
It was born in a context of dispute.
Yeah.
With when the central power and the regional powers, they are in a permanently dispute of which instance will be the more powerful and have more political power and financial power, and we have a serious difficulty. It's really difficult to us to think in
out of the box. This is Professor.
You know, I mean, yes, you never talk about a national government. You always talk about federal government, state governments.
Yeah.
The idea that you are all in the same boat. If I mean, I think a crisis actually can help in sort of making clearer that unilateral decision making, whether it is by the federal government or by the states, without taking into account the repercussions on other levels of government, can also only make everybody worse off.
That's right.
That is.
But it needs to go back. I mean, what you need to do, and this is something that Professor Rezende was, very clearly articulating over this last couple of days, is to look at how you change the incentive structures, how you change the incentive structures of the state, away from this, what you get is what I lose. So if it's a zero-sum game, then you have a problem. And the way it's been set up is in this conflict-oriented mode. So by changing the assignments, and you get greater clarity and responsibility at the state level, because at the moment that you've got split responsibilities all the way through, whether it's education or it's health or it's public services. It's not quite clear who is exactly responsible for delivery because they're mandates, partly funded by the federation or unfunded mandates in other cases. So, it's a conflict situation. So there needs to be, and this is what the Germans were trying to do also, is to unbundle the responsibilities so that you have, it's the principle of subsidiarity. You bring down responsibilities to the level that's best able to do it. And it doesn't mean that primary education is at the lowest level. If you look at what's happening in Mexico, or what's happening in a number of other countries, education is so important that it's being brought up. If you look at the United States, the poor quality of education forced the central government to move into an area which is typically considered to be the responsibility of the lowest level. So with the No Child Left Behind, the federal government actually in the United States came in to offset the recommendations of the normative theory, which was just leave it to the local governments. They will take care of it.
We are starting thinking about this.
This is very important.
This is exactly moment
It's,
not in a...
But it needs to be done in a coordinated manner. So, looking at the assignments, who does what, how it's financed, do you have an efficient revenue source for the states, efficient revenue source for the local governments, which does not add to the cost of doing business, but gets a greater accountability for the functions that you have assigned them. So that the voters hold the governors responsible for the responsibilities that the state should be performing. Similarly with the mayors.
Especially when we think about the financial difficulties that our local governments they had to face, it's a really fragile.
Yeah, I mean,
situation.
Look, I mean, in part this is self-inflicted. I mean, because many of the states with this guerra fiscal have lost revenues. And therefore, they are now in worse financial conditions than they would have been.
Yeah, the incentives are wrong. Because if you can stop paying for some key functions and then expect the central government will pick it up,
Yes.
that's a tax war.
Yeah.
That's the game that's being played. And similarly, municipalities are,
Everybody loves-
everybody loses. Municipalities are not using the tax instrument that's most appropriate to them. Because, you know, with the property tax, you know, at the very local level, if you give them the administration, the cadastre, the valuation, then they do deals with their friends and relatives who are running this stuff. So it's a question of, again, looking at how you administer it. Think outside the box, think of what will work for a country like Brazil. It doesn't all have to be done at the local level. Similarly, what's required at the state level is at the margin setting the rate, for example, on a piggyback on the income tax, not on the value-added tax. And administering the value-added tax, it adds to what is known as invoice sightseeing on origin basis. You're adding to the cost of doing business. You're adding to essentially trade wars across Brazilian states.
To begin with, quite frankly, you know, the municipalities have a source of revenue, the ISS, which is much more elastic, less visible, less less politically costly than the property tax. I mean,
but that's also a problem because
it's a big problem because
you don't have
of assignment of a revenue base,
which is
when
wrong.
it was given originally was very small, and now it's a big part of the economy is services.
And that's
so it should be.
That's a split tax base, which is also a problem in India and Pakistan. Yesterday, someone gave me an example of airline turbines, airline engines. Mm-hmm. See, previously you used to buy an airline engine. You know, it's very clear who pays the value-added tax on that. Yeah, central government. Trouble is that the turbines inside the engine are now leased. Boeing leases these turbines. Mm-hmm. So it suddenly becomes a service.
Yeah.
So, you know, is it a good or is it a service? Is it a good or is it a service? So that is a nightmare for a firm. You know, I mean, who would put an engine factory in Brazil? Or even run an airline company where you don't know who you're paying a tax to? Or you may be building up liabilities, multiple liabilities, without the possibility of passing it through to your customers, which is what a value-added tax does. It takes out the tax on export, so that it's as if you were producing in Brazil without any tax at all. So if you had a proper value-added tax, it wouldn't matter. Fact of the matter is you don't. It's on an origin basis, so it stays. So it's really very pernicious. So this is, again, the reason why India wants to do a constitutional amendment. The trouble is that even with everyone agreeing you need it, the government, the opposition, the government that was and the new opposition, they all agree it needs to be done, but they can't get it done. We can't get it done because they're only looking at that one instrument. You need to fix it, but you can't fix it in isolation. This is a clear lesson. The Chinese actually thought through this very nicely. So there's some lessons from China. There isn't enough time to go into how that was done, but it's actually quite interesting.
You're most welcome. No, I just wanted to make one comment about, you know, Ehtisham mentioned the fact, the lack of equalization transfers here in Brazil. Frankly, I think it was a big lost opportunity when the FPA could be reformed, and it was reformed so much on the margin in a very
you did a study for that.
Anything.
Yeah,
I mean, a proper system of equalization would take into account the differential needs of different states and the different capacity to generate own revenue, and so penalize renuncias fiscais due to the fiscal war would be much better mechanism for helping to put an end to the fiscal war, and more generally create a more cohesive and sistema solidario.
It becomes a glue that holds the federation together, and also creates the right incentives nationally, but also among states. It's also in the
something like a dispute.
Yeah,
you need to have disputes. Most integration, and think about the gains that all the people can have.
But
so
how it's done is actually very important, because if you make an equalization system which only looks at the actual spending and the actual taxes raised, then there is an incentive not to raise taxes and not to and to spend more and game the system. So it's very important to use what might be called standardized or potential bases, so that the incentive structures are not to game the system. Let me explain. If you have a transfer to a state, which is based on, say, population density, revenue bases, so affecting both needs and revenues, but it's fixed on those objective factors. Whatever the government does doesn't change your transfer, so the transfer becomes lump sum. In terms of incentive, the lump sum element of the transfer is essential. So if the recipient government by its action can influence the transfer, you've lost that benefit. So the design of an equalization framework, which many countries have tried and got wrong, and this is a long lecture, but it's very important to do this right, because you change the incentive structures and make the transfers lump sum, then there's no possibility of playing games. And then the incentive to engage in tax wars also goes down, provided you have clear spending responsibilities and you have fixed your revenue assignments. So you can't just put an equalization framework in the current system and expect it to work. So the equalization framework has to go hand in hand with cleaning up the revenue assignments and the spending requirements. So, and then you can get an equalization framework that will actually be lump sum and change the incentive for engaging in tax wars and fiscal wars. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So as Rosende was saying, you have to go back and think about what you want from the federation.
That's right.
So think about what this federation is going to do in the medium term.
And adopt a way.
The thing is, Brazil is an enormously rich country. Natural resources, human resources, location. It's just not making full use of its potential.
We must do this work together.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Professor,
thank you very much.
It's a
great pleasure.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much for your interview.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a really great pleasure to have you here in the DP and to know a little bit about your things and your reflections concerning the actual situation of Brazil and the world and these matters.
Thank you for the opportunity to exchange views, and I was here about 5 years ago for the celebration of the fiscal responsibility law. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, even in that, in implementing it properly. But, well, I wish you and your country all the best.